nobody other than the Timoty Foundation has provided so much to the cause of Ukraine and to Ukrainians both here and abroad. The Metropolitan Sheptytsky Institute for Eastern Christian Studies is only one of the many institutions that would not exist or be able to survive in the future were it not for you, Louise, and Jim Timoty. You have created a wonderful legacy that through your foundation, under the wise direction of your daughter Leah, will ensure the continuance of support for Ukraine and Ukrainians of all ethnic and religious backgrounds for generations to come. What else to say but simply thank you.
The topic that I want to bring up, the topic on which I'm going to devote my time with you to, is this relationship between morality and reality. And as I speak about this, I want to try to bring the present war into contact with the legacy of Andrei Sheptytsky. Whether I succeed or fail, I think I have to try to do this, because I think any attempt to evoke the moral greatness of Sheptytsky has to take into account what happens next. Or to put it a different way, the nation which he did so much to create and form is also the nation that we come to know during this war. I want to begin my speech by acknowledging the present war. I think it's very important for us to recognize at the very beginning how significant the Ukrainian battlefield, Ukrainian resistance, is for our lives beyond Ukraine. The attitude of the Russians who have designed and carried out this war is one of a colonial dismissal of Ukraine. Ukrainians cannot have their own nation, they cannot have their own state, they're not really a people, they have no history. These are all colonial attitudes, and they all begin, in my view anyway, from the same place, from the same moral failure, from the moral failure that Sheptytsky in his writings tended to refer to as self-love. And by self-love, he meant the opposite of loving one's neighbor, preoccupation with oneself, the inability to see the world from any other point of view. I have to acknowledge that Ukraine is not a problem for us, but rather a kind of solution, that the world in which Americans, and I believe Canadians and Europeans and many others live, this more or less normality that we have had for the last 2.5 years has been purchased for us by Ukrainians taking risks, by Ukrainians who are suffering. And one can talk about this, and one does, in purely strategic terms, in terms of existence. One can say, and one is right to say, the Ukrainians are fulfilling the entire NATO mission. They are. The Ukrainians are affirming that there can be a European Union. They are. The Ukrainians are defending the international legal order. That's true. Ukrainians are doing all of these things and many others. But I think just what they are doing can't be calculated or described only in these strategic terms, important as they are. There's something deeper than that which is happening as well. The Ukrainians are also setting an example. When I spoke to Volodymyr Zelensky about Ukrainian endurance and about, in particular, his decision to remain in Ukraine, he answered it in a very striking way, a way which was entirely deprived of self-love. And I'm not saying, by the way, that the man is a saint or that he's perfect. None of us is, yet anyway. But what I am saying is that he was able to describe the situation without arrogance and without self-love. When I asked him about his stay in Kiev as the president, he denied that that was what had happened. He said that the president, now I'm quoting, he said the president is like one grain of sand in the hourglass. And when the hourglass turns, that one grain of sand turns with all the other grains in the hourglass. So something had changed very drastically, but he was doing nothing on his own. He was simply doing what his people expected him to be doing. And so when I asked him, okay, what does it mean to have stayed in terms of freedom? He said, well, the interesting thing is, there wasn't a choice involved. There wasn't a choice involved. And what he meant was something like this, and we talked it through. If you were a free person, and you go through your life making free choices on the basis of the examples in your life, he spoke with his parents, then at a certain point, because over time you build up character, you might arrive at a conjuncture where you feel like, in fact, where it really is the case that you can only do one thing. And that this is freedom. And that may seem paradoxical, because it may seem like freedom means doing whatever you want. I think that's wrong. I think freedom means having the ability to make sets of moral choices over time. And at the end of those moral choices, sometimes you arrive in circumstances where there isn't really a choice. It's obvious, given the free person who you are, what it is that you have to do. Which brings me to Sheptytsky and Sheptytsky's decision to shelter and to rescue well over 100 Jewish children during wartime. I want to speak to this action as reflecting not something which Sheptytsky decided to do on the spur of the moment, or even decided to do in the exceptional circumstances, although they were exceptional. I think it's much more like, and here I'm influenced, by the way, by the wonderful translations and commentary of Sheptytsky's pastoral letters by my postdoc, Daniel Fedorovich. I think it's much more like a moment where it was clear to him what he had to do. The principles that we invoke to explain Sheptytsky's actions in 1942, 43, 44 are the same principles that Sheptytsky was himself enunciating decades before. This is a few months before the perhaps better known pastoral letter of November 1942, Nebubi, Thou Shalt Not Kill, in which Sheptytsky writes, "We have nevertheless frequently drawn the attention of our reverend clergy and our beloved people to the supreme importance of observing the sacred law of love for one's neighbor and the extreme social and national danger of violating the commandment, Thou shalt not kill." He continues, "Those who do not consider political killing a sin delude themselves and others, strangely pretending that politics can relieve a man of obligation to God's law and justify a crime contrary to human nature. It is not so." So, Sheptytsky, in these texts, and these are two among many texts in 1942 especially, in which it's clear that the pain of the crimes around him has been arriving to him, and he is pained not only by the murder of the Jews, but also the participation of Ukrainians. This is very important. And it's to those pains that he is reacting in this unusually forthcoming way. There's something very humble and very difficult about the sources around rescue, which I'd like to share with you. The people, whether they were Ukrainians or Belarusians, or Poles, or Russians, or whomever it might have been, the people who rescued Jews, the Christians who rescued Jews, almost never said very much about it. And when they did say things, the things that they tended to say seem incomprehensible. They would say things like, "This was just hospitality," or "I was simply behaving normally." A lot of them say this. And this is very interesting, of course, because when they say normal, they're not talking about reality, they're talking about morality. When it comes to morality, there's a strange way in which Sheptytsky, although exceptional, was also typical, at least typical of that small group of people who were able to maintain that sense of normality in those terribly trying times. And of course, you understood my other point, which is that Sheptytsky was also like that, in that the morality that guided his actions was not a product of the war. The morality that guided his actions was a continuation of prior commitments that continued during very difficult and very different circumstances. Sheptytsky was able to rescue so many Jews because he was in a position which was more like that of a diplomat. Of course, not all diplomats rescued Jews, but most of the people who rescued large numbers of Jews were in fact diplomats. And because of Sheptytsky's rank, He was treated as someone who was very difficult to touch. He wasn't quite beyond, but he was almost beyond the reach of persecution by the German occupation authorities. He was also very different from the Ukrainian or the Polish or the Belarusian peasants in that he was a very wealthy man. He was a very wealthy man. And he was someone who, over the decades, had used his wealth to try to build up the things we would now call Ukrainian civil society. In that way, Sheptytsky was different as well. But in that way, I think we could also say that Sheptytsky was exemplary and perhaps fits into a tradition into which he isn't always fitted, which is precisely this Ukrainian tradition of horizontal self-organization, of philanthropists who help other people do the things that they otherwise wouldn't be able to do. And I think in this gathering, this is probably a very appropriate thing to mention, that Sheptytsky is also different in that way, that he enabled others. And during the Second World War, he actually said something quite interesting about this, quite direct about it, in which he directed priests. I don't know if this is on the curriculum of the Sheptytsky Institute, so I tread carefully here, in which he directed priests to study political science and sociology. Sheptytsky writes, "Obviously, not every priest can devote himself to such studies, but we stand to gain a lot if just some of us, motivated by sincere interest, either from formal academic study or by conducting informal research of the sort England can do, become at best specialist or at a minimum modestly familiar with the study of sociology and politics." He wrote that in 1941. So Sheptytsky was, to close, so Sheptytsky was, on the one hand, very unusual during the Second World War, exemplary in the sense that he did something which very few people did. The exemplary action he took during the Second World War, in my view, was not a break with prior moral commitments, but rather a realization of them. And there's something, I think, quite interesting in the realization of simple ideas during difficult times, as opposed to the theorization of difficult times, which is something else entirely. Sheptytsky was a typical exception in the sense that he was like other exceptions in the time and place, in referring to the parable of the Good Samaritan, in thinking of the neighbor as the suffering other, and is thinking of mercy as precisely that state of being by which humans can take a step towards the metaphysical or towards the heavenly. But he was different from them in that he also, all his life, did and had to think about politics. And this, of course, returns us to our moment and to this war which is continuing now, where, of course, the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian nation, Ukrainian leaders, Ukrainian activists in civil society, Ukrainian soldiers, all of them must fight this war in a certain way. They must fight this war in such a way so that one knows that they are different from the invaders and the occupiers. But not just for that reason, not just for propaganda purposes, but also because it has to do with being who you are. And at the same time, so that's morality, at the same time there is the reality, which is that Ukrainians must have the institutions, must have the civil society, must have the philanthropy, must have the international partners in order to be able to win in this war. And what one wants to think, and what one wants to wish for Ukrainians, is that this could work. That one can do certain things in an exemplary way, and have history show that your institutions can survive the test. But however that may be, I think when you use the idea of acknowledgement, it's very important to acknowledge not just what Ukrainians are doing and how difficult it is, but also that what they're doing isn't only on the material plane. It isn't only about the strategy of the territory. It's also about making it possible for us to believe in certain things, which it would be hard for us to believe in or harder for us to believe in if they didn't resist. And again, however that may be, I think one should acknowledge, and this in the conference which lies before us in the next couple of days will be the occasion to acknowledge, that the morality of Andrei Sheptytsky and the reality of Andrei Sheptytsky And the inevitable position that he was in which he was always navigating between the two, that the way he navigated between the two did much more to form the Ukrainian nation than we have hitherto realized. I think Sheptytsky is much more a figure of the future than the past. I think he's someone about whom we not only still have much to learn, but also someone whose example will still have formative value as we move into the future. Thank you very much.
Після банкету на доповіді про життєвий шлях митрополита Андрея Шептицького, виголошеного академіком Тімоті Снайдер, далі в приміщеннях Торонтівського університету відбулася дводенна наукова міжнародна конференція про заслуги Андрея Шептицького та вшанування 80-ліття смерті митрополита.
The thing that constantly has to be remembered is the first words of Bob Magwitch's introduction to Morality and Reality. Those first words are, Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky was first and foremost a man of God. And I am convinced that the man is a saint precisely because he was willing to risk, he was willing to get into the mire, the dirt, the swamp of day-to-day problems, which, as anyone knows, is the most difficult thing for anyone to do.
Sheptytsky was exemplary and unique because he played this dual role of the leader of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, but also as one of the leaders of the Ukrainian political or Ukrainian national community when there is no independence and there was no proper political representation. So he could not afford not to intervene constantly in the public sphere in defense both of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church but also in defense of the Ukrainian people to all the authorities under which the Ukrainians were subject. First, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then the Russian Empire, then the Polish state in the interwar period, and then of course the Nazi and Soviet occupations. And he was extraordinary because he went beyond the call of duty in the sense that, yes, he represented the typical position of the Catholic Church of basically protecting the church and the freedom of the church, and also to be obedient to the authorities, to cooperate, to collaborate with the authorities. But he went beyond that, a prophetic voice, to also protest when the authorities were not only curtailing the freedom of the church, but curtailing what he thought were the rights of Ukrainians to their humanity. And so when you compare other Catholic leaders in the 1930s, when basically most of them were involved in developing a kind of political Catholicism as a third way between liberal democracy and socialist dictatorship. But most of these went in the direction of semi-fascist, organicist, corporatist projects. And here you have his defense of a kind of humanitarian politics that basically speak in terms of moral universalism, not only protecting our faithful, but protecting all humans. And so Sheptytsky could go beyond, despite being representative of the Greek Catholic Church and of the Ukrainian national community, he really understood, and he was also solidarious with Poles, with not only with Greek Catholics, but with Roman Catholics and with Orthodox. So it was this ability he had to be in between peoples and in between churches, and to somehow really represent the notion of love your brother, and especially in the context of the bloodlines, the most important moral commandment was thou shalt not kill. And this is a commandment that he repeated again and again, first against the Ukrainian youth that were involved in terrorist acts, in the first political assassination. But he continued basically proclaiming the same pastoral letter to in every political regime, also to the perpetrators, not only of political violence, but also of murderous crimes. And of course, most extraordinary is his own role in saving Jews under very difficult and courageous conditions.